Street Fighter has over 80 characters spread across nearly 4 decades of games, and every single one of them has a story that most players have never heard. From secret bosses designed to save dying arcades, to characters built backwards from popularity they were never supposed to have. Today, I'm breaking down every character in the franchise and everything that makes them matter, starting with the one that started it all, Ryu. Ryu didn't just debut in the original 1987 Street Fighter arcade game. He became the template. Every fighting game protagonist that came after him was built in his shadow. But here's the thing about Ryu that nobody really thinks about. He was designed to be nobody, and that was completely on purpose. Creator Takashi Nishiyama deliberately left Ryu's identity vague. His name, his appearance, his backstory, all kept ambiguous so that any player in any arcade in any country could look at him and see themselves. He wasn't Japanese. He wasn't American. He was just a fighter in a white GI who threw fireballs. Those fireballs, by the way, have appeared in every main Street Fighter title since 1987. Every single one. But here's where it gets interesting. Ryu's story arc, his endless search for perfection as a martial artist, has been running continuously from 1987 through Street Fighter 6 in 2023. That's one of the longest unbroken character narratives in all of gaming. He is the franchise. And yet, in competitive play, Ryu has consistently landed in mid-tier rankings. The face of the entire series, the most iconic fighter in the roster, and tournament players will tell you he's average at best. The character who represents fighting game perfection in the story has never achieved it in actual gameplay. But his training partner, completely different story. Ken Masters. Ken Masters is the most successful accident in fighting game history. It debuted in 1987, right alongside Ryu, as the second playable character in the original Street Fighter. But here's the thing, he was never supposed to matter. Capcom designed him as a one-off rival, a wealthy American counterpart to Ryu's Wandering Warrior, and that was supposed to be the end of it. But then Street Fighter 2 became the biggest arcade phenomenon on the planet, and suddenly Capcom needed Ken to be more than a palette swap with a different haircut. So they built his entire mythology backwards. The training partnership with Ryu, the shared master Guken, the philosophical divide between discipline and flash, all of it was constructed after the fact to justify a character who already existed. Ken Masters didn't earn his backstory through careful planning. He earned it through sheer commercial demand. And the rivalry itself? It was deliberately modeled on the Karate Kid franchise, which was one of the biggest cultural influences on early Street Fighter's design. The disciplined student versus the flashy rival. Two fighters, same foundation, completely different philosophies. That structure carried over directly into gameplay. Ryu's Hadoken rewarded patience and spacing. Ken's Shoryuken rewarded aggression and timing. Two moves designed as mirror images of each other from day one. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite being an afterthought, Ken has held top-tier competitive status across 11 different Street Fighter entries, more consistently than almost any character in the roster. And his Street Fighter 6 redesign, which traded the flashy red GI for a grittier, divorced dad-on-a-mission look, has been called the most radical visual overhaul ever attempted on an original roster character. Not bad for a guy who was never supposed to come back. But if Ken's story is about being built backwards from success, the next character was built forwards from a scar, Sagat. Before M. Bison, before Akuma, before any of the villains you actually remember, there was Sagat, the final boss of the original 1987 Street Fighter, the first real wall the franchise ever built. And for most players in 1987, he was basically unbeatable. But here's the thing about Sagat. In that original game, he was nothing. A tall sprite with no backstory, no motivation, no personality. Just a big guy you had to punch until the game ended. He had zero narrative depth. He existed purely as a difficulty spike. Then Street Fighter 2 came out and changed everything. Capcom looked at this blank slate final boss and decided to give him a massive scar across his chest. One visual detail. That's it. But that scar told a story all by itself because in the new canon, Ryu gave him that wound during their Street Fighter 1 encounter. Suddenly, Sagat wasn't just a boss. He was a man with a grudge, a defeated champion obsessed with the fighter who scarred him. And from that single detail, Capcom built one of the longest villain to anti-hero arcs in fighting game history. Across 36 years, Sagat went from faceless antagonist to Shadaloo enforcer to a fighter who slowly realized revenge was consuming him. His Tiger Knee and Tiger Cannon were the first animal-themed special moves in the series, a naming convention Capcom would recycle for decades. But the moves aren't what made him iconic. The scar did all the heavy lifting. Everything else, the redemption, the rivalry, the emotional complexity, grew backwards from one chest wound on a character who originally had nothing. He's one of only 3 characters from 1987 still playable in Street Fighter 6. The other 2 are Ryu and Ken. Therefore, Sagat isn't just a legacy character. He's proof that a great hook can carry a character character for nearly 4 decades, even when the writing comes decades after the design. But if Sagat represents the franchise's first antagonist, the next character represents something entirely different. America's answer to the World Warriors, Guile. When Guile showed up in Street Fighter II in 1991, he looked like Jean-Claude Van Damme had wandered directly off a movie set and into an arcade cabinet. The flat top, the military dog tags, the impossibly sculpted physique. That wasn't an accident. Capcom modeled him after Van Damme's late 80s action hero persona, and the resemblance was so obvious that it basically became an open secret in the gaming world. But here's where it gets interesting. Guile wasn't just a cool design slapped onto a fighter. He was Capcom's first military character, and his addition signaled something huge for the franchise. Street Fighter was no longer just about martial artists. It was becoming a roster of archetypes, each one pulling from a different corner of global pop culture, and his moveset reflected that philosophy. The Sonic Boom was one of the first horizontal traveling projectiles in fighting game history. Not a fireball that arced or faded, a clean, straight-line wall of energy that forced your opponent to deal with it or eat damage. That single move essentially invented the zoning archetype, a defensive playstyle built around controlling space rather than rushing in. Dozens of characters across multiple franchises would be modeled on what Guile established. But here's the part that makes Guile genuinely fascinating. Capcom designed him as a buffer character. Simpler inputs, a defensive toolkit anchored by the flash kick anti-air. The whole package meant to help newer players transition from arcade to home console. Sounds approachable. Right, it wasn't. Not even close. Because zoning requires something no tutorial can teach you. Positioning awareness. Knowing exactly where to stand, when to throw the boom, when to hold back and wait. Casual players see Guile and think he's straightforward. Competitive players know his skill ceiling is one of the highest in the entire series. That gap between perception and reality has fueled decades of debate about whether zoning is cheap or legitimately elite. And honestly, that argument says more about fighting game philosophy than it does about Guile himself. 18 consecutive main entries. The same flat top across all 6 Street Fighter generations. Never changed, never needed to. But if Guile redefined how a character controls space, the next fighter on this list redefined who gets to fight in the first place. Chun-Li. Capcom didn't add Chun-Li to Street Fighter II because they wanted a female character on the roster. They added her because they wanted a female character who could win. That distinction changed fighting games forever. Here's the thing. Market research in Japan showed female arcade players wanted representation, and plenty of studios would have responded by throwing in a weak, decorative character and calling it progress. But Capcom made a decision that sounds obvious now and was borderline radical in 1991. They made Chun-Li one of the strongest fighters in the game, not middle of the pack. Not viable if you really know what you're doing, genuinely top tier. She couldn't be dismissed as a token addition because she was too busy destroying people in tournament brackets. But building her moveset created a problem nobody anticipated. Her lightning kick needed to display multiple rapid kicks in a single animation sequence, and the existing Street Fighter II engine literally wasn't designed to handle that. The programmers had to build entirely new animation architecture just to make one move work. A character that was supposed to prove female fighters belonged in the genre ended up pushing the actual technology forward, and she never stopped. Chun-Li has appeared in 23 consecutive Street Fighter releases, the longest unbroken streak of any female character in the series. She's won major championships across 8 different Street Fighter iterations. No other female character in fighting game history comes close to that competitive record. Her backstory as a law enforcement officer hunting M. Bison gave Street Fighter its first real narrative spine, a protagonist-antagonist thread that would drive the franchise's story for decades. But the conversation around Chun-Li has never fully settled. Some entries treat her as a fully realized character with genuine depth. Others lean hard into visual appeal at the expense of everything else. That tension has made her a permanent reference point in the broader debate about how games portray women, and it's a debate that still doesn't have a clean answer, which is honestly more interesting than if it did. Speaking of complicated legacies, the next character on this list walked directly into that same conversation the moment she debuted, Cammy White. Cammy White was never supposed to be here. Not in this video, not in the franchise, not in any Street Fighter game after 1992. She was a stopgap, a temporary addition to pad out the Champion Edition roster, and Capcom fully intended to replace her in the next iteration. That didn't happen. Here's the thing. When Cammy dropped into Street Fighter II Champion Edition in 1992, she immediately stood out for reasons that had nothing to do with long-term planning. She was the second female fighter on the roster, arriving roughly a year after the original Street Fighter II launch, and she came with a backstory that nobody in the franchise had tried before. Cammy wasn't a cop like Chun-Li or a martial artist with a vendetta. She was MI6, a full intelligence operative baked into her identity from day one, not as background flavor but as her entire deal. But the thing that really turned heads was technical. Her cannon drill required the character model to rotate a full 360 degrees mid-animation in 1992 on arcade hardware. That was genuinely difficult to pull off. Most sprite-based fighters couldn't handle smooth rotation like that without looking janky, but Capcom made it work, and it gave Cammy a visual signature that felt completely different from anyone else on the roster. And then came the test audiences. Capcom put the next iteration in front of players expecting to cycle Cammy out, but the response was overwhelming. Players didn't want her gone. They wanted more of her, so she stayed. And then she stayed again and again. The 20 consecutive main entry appearances later, the character who was supposed to be a placeholder has been in the franchise for over 3 decades, entirely because players refused to let her go. The competitive side of Cammy is mostly settled. She's consistently mid to high tier, and nobody really argues about it. Where the friction lives is her visual design, and how it's evolved across different eras. Whether those changes represent the franchise growing up or just repeating patterns the community has already criticized in other games is a conversation that never quite resolves. But honestly, for a character who was literally designed to be temporary, the fact that we're still debating anything about Cammy White is the real legacy. But if Cammy's story is about an accidental icon who stuck around, the next character is about something far more deliberate and far more dangerous. Akuma. Here's the thing about Akuma. He wasn't born from some creative vision or a designer's passion project. He was born from a spreadsheet. By 1993, Capcom's internal testing revealed a problem. Players were getting bored. Street Fighter II had dominated arcades for months, but the roster was feeling stale, and quarter revenue was starting to dip. Capcom needed a solution, and that solution was a character nobody knew existed. Akuma debuted in Street Fighter II Turbo as a hidden boss, the first unlockable major character in franchise history. But you couldn't just stumble into him. The command inputs required to find him were deliberately obscured, buried so deep that only the most obsessive players would ever discover them. That was the entire point. See, Capcom didn't just add a new fighter, they created a metagame around the act of finding him. Arcades were buzzing with rumors, players were sharing half-correct input sequences like Underground Intel, and suddenly a game people were drifting away from had everyone's attention again. But Akuma's real legacy goes way beyond a clever marketing trick. His design introduced something fighting games had never seen before: the Dark Mirror protagonist. Where Ryu pursues discipline, restraint, and mastery through control, Akuma pursues raw power at any cost. Same training lineage, same foundational techniques, completely opposite philosophies. That ideological split became the blueprint for antagonist design across the entire fighting game genre for the next 3 decades. Every evil version of the hero character you've ever seen in a fighting game owes something to Akuma. And then there's the Raging Demon. The Shun Goku Satsu was designed as the single most powerful attack in Street Fighter II, with inputs kept secret specifically to reward execution skill. His eye color changing mid-animation was a genuine technical achievement for 1993 sprite work. He's appeared in 16 consecutive Street Fighter entries since then, more consistently than any non-original character in the series. And the competitive debate about whether the Raging Demon represents brilliant risk-reward design or a fundamental balance failure has never been resolved. 30 years, still arguing. But if Akuma represents the dark mirror of the hero, the next character represents something far worse: the franchise's ultimate evil. What, and the man who made Psycho Power a household term, M. Bison. Every franchise needs a final boss that makes you feel like the entire game was building toward one moment. M. Bison didn't just fill that role, he invented it. When he debuted as the final boss of Street Fighter II in 1991, Bison was something the franchise had never attempted. Sagat was a tough fight at the end of the original game, sure, but Bison was a spectacle. His Psycho Power system was the first supernatural fighting style in the entire franchise, completely breaking away from the martial arts grounding that defined every other character on the roster. And this wasn't just a lore distinction. Capcom's developers had to write custom programming to produce the visual effects for his Psycho Crusher and Psycho Power animations, effects that no previous arcade fighter had ever attempted. The guy literally glowed purple and flew across the screen in 1991. That was unheard of. But here's where it gets interesting. Bison wasn't designed to be deep. His personality and appearance were pulled from a composite of real-world dictators and 1980s action movie villains. He was built to be immediately readable as the big evil. No nuance, no inner conflict, just pure dominance in a red uniform. And for a 1991 arcade cabinet, that was enough. What nobody expected was that this one-dimensional final boss would become one of gaming's most extensively developed villains after the fact. Everything compelling about Bison, the the psychological depth, the expanded ideology, the backstory that actually makes him terrifying instead of just powerful. All of it was built retroactively across Street Fighter IV and Street Fighter VI. He started as a narrative blank and became a franchise pillar, which mirrors what happened with Sagat. Except Bison's transformation is more extreme because he was the ceiling of the entire game. He's appeared in 19 consecutive main entries as either a playable character or boss, and there's a persistent competitive theory that Capcom has intentionally kept his playable versions artificially powerful to match his narrative status. The idea being that Capcom simply won't allow the franchise's signature villain to feel weak in anyone's hands. Whether that's true or not, the fact that the debate exists tells you everything about how seriously the community takes his presence. But if Bison defined what a Street Fighter villain looks like, the next character on this list redefined what a villain is allowed to feel like. Juri Han. When Juri Han dropped into Street Fighter IV in 2008, she wasn't just a new character. She was the first major addition to the franchise in 15 years. The last time Capcom introduced someone with that level of impact was Akuma in 1993. That's a decade and a half of silence. And then they show up with someone who looks, fights, and thinks like nobody the series had ever produced. But here's where it gets interesting. Look at her design, the streetwear, the K-pop influenced styling, the attitude that feels ripped from a completely different franchise. None of that was accidental. Capcom built Juri specifically to pull in players under 25, and it worked. She's maintained higher adoption rates in that demographic than any other character on the roster. But she wasn't just a marketing play with a cool outfit. Juri was the first Street Fighter character whose entire identity revolves around psychological trauma and an addiction to violence. Not as backstory, not as motivation for revenge, as the actual point. Compare her to MC Bison for a second, because the contrast is everything. Bison wants control. He wants to dominate, to rule, to bend the world to his will. Juri doesn't want any of that. She just wants the feeling, the rush of hurting someone. That distinction sounds subtle, but it fundamentally changes how the character operates in every scene she's in, and it explains why she resonates with certain players, in a way the older roster never could. Her technical design matched that philosophy. The feint kick was the first move in Street Fighter IV built around frame-perfect execution, setting a difficulty standard that told casual players this character wasn't for them. Competitive players call her a technical mastery showcase. Casual players find her overwhelming. That gap has followed her all the way through to Street Fighter VI. But the real debate around Juri isn't mechanical. It's whether her trauma-based characterization is genuine depth or just aesthetic. Some fans praise the complexity. Others argue the franchise uses her mental health as flavor text without ever actually exploring it. It's a conversation that hasn't been resolved, and honestly, it probably shouldn't be. But if Juri represents the moment Street Fighter started building its next generation, the character who was literally designed to carry that generation forward is a whole different story. Luke Sullivan. Every character on this list has a verdict. Ryu is the foundation. Chun-Li broke barriers. Akuma redefined what a secret character could be. M. Bison set the standard for fighting game villainy. Their legacies are locked in, debated endlessly, but ultimately settled. Luke Sullivan doesn't have that yet, and that's exactly what makes him the most interesting name on this entire list. Here's the thing. In 2022, Luke dropped as late-stage DLC for Street Fighter V, a new face nobody asked for, slotted into the tail end of a game's lifecycle where most players had already moved on. But less than 12 months later, he was the face of Street Fighter VI, the default character on the select screen, the guy the story mode revolves around. That's never happened before in franchise history. No character has gone from DLC afterthought to franchise protagonist that fast. But the real earthquake isn't the speed of his promotion, it's what his promotion means. For 36 years, Ryu was the default, the wandering martial artist with no last name, no flashy personality, designed to be a blank canvas. Luke Sullivan is the opposite of that in every way. He has a full name, he has cybernetic enhancements and military training. He has a specific personality that you either vibe with or you don't. Capcom didn't just replace their protagonist, they replaced their entire philosophy of what a protagonist should be, and his gameplay reflects that same shift. Luke's flash break system required completely new programming architecture in Street Fighter VI's engine. He wasn't built on existing character frameworks, he was built from scratch, and the mechanical systems created for him became the template for how future characters in the game would function. He's not just a new face, he's the foundation of a new era's design language. But here's where the community splits. Some players see Luke as the fresh start Street Fighter desperately needed after nearly 4 decades of Ryu carrying the narrative. Others see a replacement being dressed up as Evolution, a character whose power level feels inflated specifically because Capcom needs him to matter. That debate isn't going to be settled anytime soon. Street Fighter 6 is still releasing content. Luke's story arc is literally still being written. Whether he becomes the next Ryu or a footnote that gets quietly phased out in Street Fighter 7 is a question nobody can answer yet, and maybe that's the perfect place to end. This franchise started with a character who was deliberately designed to belong to everyone, and now it's betting its future on a character who belongs very specifically to himself. Whether the audience follows him is still an open question. 36 years of history, dozens of characters with locked-in legacies, and one guy whose story hasn't been written yet. If you enjoyed this video and want to see every villain in Street Fighter explained, click the video on the screen now.